I'm a registered nurse in a small rural Minnesota hospital and have been in this job for approximately 4 years. One of the most difficult problems we face here is the high rate of substance abuse and mental disorders. I live in a city that is neither too big nor too small and is surrounded by fields and small towns, but despite its size, we see a lot of cases a year, mostly related to substance abuse, mostly methamphetamines. This is where I do my nursing, and before I forget, for the love of all that is good, please do not use meth under any circumstances. Really, it will ruin your life in 1,000 ways. Advice from someone who deals with these patients every day. One thing people often ignore is that drug addiction not only affects you physically, but can also lead to very serious and sometimes irreversible mental health problems. It's a vicious cycle that is often difficult to break. It's unclear if the mental illness comes first, or if the drugs are the culprit, but I remember one night in particular that encapsulates this struggle. Our local emergency medical services team received a call about a man who was having a drug-induced psychosis. They took him to our psychiatric unit, and he was escorted by both paramedics and local police. When I finally saw him, it was clear that this man was completely out of his mind. He was about 50 years old and looked completely disheveled. His condition was deplorable. His gray hair was matted, he hadn't shaved in days, and his clothes were dirty and worn. He was almost like a character in a horror movie, who spoke incoherently and made strange noises. His state of paranoia was very evident. He was extremely hostile and was convinced that we were all there to harm him. We tried to calm the situation without having to restrain him, but I quickly understood that this was not going to work. I talked to the doctor in charge, and we decided that the best option was to give him an injection of a powerful antipsychotic, because his condition was really critical. So I prepared the syringe and headed back to the psychiatric area. When I entered, there was already quite a group of people there, and some of our security guards, as well as 3 or 4 police officers, were also present. The patient, although still restless, seemed a little calmer since the last time I saw him, but he still needed that injection to really relax. I approached him with the syringe in my hand, but as soon as he noticed, bam, his paranoia came rushing back. Even though I had tried to speak to him in a calm, gentle tone, I could see in his eyes that he felt cornered. However, I decided to try again to calm him down, so I moved a little closer and told him in a gentle tone that everything was going to be okay and that we were just going to help him. So I got everything ready to administer the injection in his right arm. I pulled up his shirt sleeve, wiped the injection site with a cotton ball, and while talking to one of the policemen about the situation, I told him that I was going to administer the medication to keep him under control. Then I gave him the classic countdown, 1, 2, 3, and stuck the needle in his arm quickly and firmly. Now, a note on how I do this. I usually hold the syringe as if it were a dart so that my hand doesn't shake as I insert the needle. In those moments, connecting with the patient on a human level is essential. But I'll be honest, technique is also crucial, especially in tense situations like this one. As the medication began to take effect, the atmosphere in the room took an unexpected turn. We all hoped that, with a little time and treatment, this man could regain some peace of mind. However, fear and violence are always around the corner in these parts. I adjusted my grip on the syringe, holding it like a cigarette so I could use my thumb to press down on the plunger. But just then, the patient panicked at the sight of the needle and panicked, pulling away from me abruptly. The syringe was still in his arm as he moved, but suddenly he jerked it out and locked his eyes on me. Before I could react, he lunged at me, wielding the syringe as if it were a weapon. The officers reacted quickly, and one of them shouted over the needle to warn everyone in the room, but it was too late. The patient was freaking out, and although I tried to dodge him, I felt a sharp blow and a stabbing pain in my left thigh. The syringe fell to the floor, but the needle was broken. At that moment, everyone jumped on the patient to control him, while he was screaming like crazy. I quickly grabbed the syringe from the floor, trying to process what had just happened, and realizing that the needle was stuck in my leg. As the officers continued to try to control the patient, who was still completely out of it, I told the doctor what had happened, almost panicking just thinking about the possible diseases that could have affected me. The doctor's eyes went wide when I told him the needle was stuck in my leg, but before he said anything, I immediately ran to the bathroom to check. Fortunately, the needle was not completely buried in my leg. There was a small segment about 0.5 millimeter that was outside my flesh, and that was enough to be able to remove the needle with a clamp. However, I was not out of danger yet. Now I had to wait for a series of lab tests to rule out that I could have transmitted any disease. After all the fuss, the man finally calmed down, and another nurse was able to administer the painkiller. When everything was calmer, a policeman asked me if I wanted to report the patient. At first I said no because I felt sorry for him. Clearly this man was out of his mind and not in control of his actions. But as the shift progressed, my perspective changed. Why let him off so easily just because he was high on methamphetamine? Why would I have to carry the discomfort of this experience for the rest of my career, without this person taking any responsibility? In the end, I called the officer and decided to press charges, but 2 years later it all came to nothing, because they said the patient was not in his 5 senses, so I just left it at that. Fortunately, all my labs came back fine, so beyond the injury to my leg and the big scare I got, this scary incident had left no other sequelae to regret. I was working as a cleaning staff at a local hospital and was used to seeing people come in the worst conditions, but there is one patient that will stick with me forever. What happened with him is one of those stories that you really can't forget. One night I heard that his house caught fire while he and his wife Elsa were sleeping. In the middle of the night, they realized that the fire had taken over half the house. This man, whose name was Phil, managed to get out thanks to the help of his neighbors, but his wife was not so lucky. People whispered that she was so badly burned that her skin had literally melted. It was a kind of tragedy that made my hair stand on end just imagining it. Phil arrived at the hospital with his left hand and leg severely damaged, but luckily his condition was treatable, if you could call it that. I remember that of all the rooms in the hospital, his was the one that made me the most uneasy every time I went in to clean it. From the moment I walked through the door, a shiver would run down my spine. The stench of burning flesh was unbearable, and besides, his room was always freezing cold, as if life itself had been snuffed out in a breath. Phil was heavily sedated most of the time, fighting pain I couldn't even describe. The suffering of burn victims is something that leaves you speechless and makes you pray to God to never put you through something like that. Once I was assigned the night shift, which I actually preferred, as it was quieter. All the patients were asleep and I could concentrate better on my work. It was around 1:20 a.m. and I went to mop the floor in Phil's room. But when I walked in, I came upon a lone figure in the middle of the room, and what I saw really chilled my blood. It was Phil standing there sobbing. The look of his burned hands and left leg was bleak. He was staring into a dark corner of the wall and whispering things that echoed with a haunting tone. "Why are you doing this to me? What more do you want from me? Please leave me alone." I couldn't help but intervene and asked him, "Hey man, are you okay?" At that moment he turned to me, and the pain in his face was so palpable I could almost feel it. Then, he pointed to the dark corner and said in an almost broken voice, "Tell her to go away. She keeps coming back. Isn't she supposed to be dead?" I was very confused and a shiver began to run through my body. I asked, "What are you talking about, Phil?" "Elsa, my wife," he said with a terror in his voice that almost made me recoil. "She's always here, lurking." I stood transfixed listening to him, but before I could process what he was saying, he collapsed, dropping to the floor like a sack of potatoes. In shock and fear, I spent a couple of seconds doing nothing, until I had a reality check and realized I had to alert the doctors and nurses. When I finally did, they came running. They were all amazed to see how, despite his very painful state, this man had managed to get out of bed on his own. From that night on, every time I had to clean his room, I was filled with anxiety. I knew there was some logical explanation for what was happening, but, believe me, when I was alone in that dark room with only the sound of Phil's dazed breathing, I couldn't help but think that perhaps it was his deceased wife materializing in that dark corner, watching over him in his suffering. The truth is that it terrified me, and unwittingly every visit to that room became a kind of excursion into the realm of the unexplainable, a place where grief and death coincided in ways I am unable to explain or even understand. I was simply a cleaner, but whenever I crossed the threshold of the door to room 102, I found myself caught in the middle of a drama that I could not fully comprehend, but that could be sensed in the atmosphere. Shortly after that, a few days passed and I noticed that Phil was getting worse and worse. Not only was it noticeable in his burns, his behavior was getting stranger and stranger. I could hear his screams echoing from his room, and every time that happened, doctors and nurses would run like firemen to control the fire. To tell you the truth, That started to make me quite nervous. I decided to change my shift so I wouldn't have to go to his room, but it seemed that fate had other things planned for me. One morning, my boss called me, and while I was waiting for him to scold me for something, he told me that if I did that night's shift, I would be paid double. Who could turn down an offer like that? With the times, I needed the money, and badly. So I accepted, thinking maybe I could deal with it, especially since I would have part of the next day off. I went home, took a short break, and got ready for the night shift. I needed to be in my 5 senses, so I tried not to think too much about Phil. When I returned, my head was clearer, and as usual, I started doing my rounds, cleaning rooms. After a while, I decided to take a short break in the cafeteria. While I was there, trying to enjoy a drink, I heard footsteps in the hallway. That's when I turned around, and when I did, I was cold. There was Phil, standing at the end of the corridor. His limbs still bore the deep marks of the burns he had suffered, and half of his face was covered with hideous scars. "Everything all right, Phil? You should go back to your room," I said, even though my heart was pounding. The sight of him, this forlorn, really unsettled me. He had a fixed, almost statue-like gaze, breathing raggedly, and as if he were somewhere else. "Phil, you're scaring me, man. Why don't you go lay down? You shouldn't be here." He was quiet for a moment, but what he said next chilled my blood. "She's not going to rest until she kills me." God, it's really hard to describe how terrifying those words sounded. "Come on, Phil, don't start again." I tried to reason with him, but with fear very much in my system. "No, it's different this time," he replied, his voice cracking. "She's right behind you, and she's saying to me, 'Come with me.'" I turned around, but of course no one was there. Just a heavy silence that sent shivers down my spine. Phil's next action was something I will never be able to forget. He pulled out a surgical knife that was on the table near him and started cutting his lips. Drops of blood quickly splattered on the white floor as if he was painting a horror play. But he didn't stop there. He continued to bite his lips, and the sound of his flesh being torn filled me with nausea and horror at the same time. Suddenly she let out a scream of pain that echoed through the room. "Are you happy now? Are you angry that I'm still alive and you're not? Fine, I'm ending this today. I'm going to end it all." At that moment, I was totally out of breath. Phil started stabbing himself in the chest repeatedly with the instrument in his hand. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. Blood was gushing out and I was completely paralyzed with terror, as if panic had taken over my body. Instantly, several nurses and doctors rushed in, and then chaos erupted. Phil was rushed to the ICU in the blink of an eye, and amidst a huge commotion that caused several patients to peek through the doors. But it was too late. He did not survive his injuries. I was in shock, unable to process what had just happened. Inside me, I felt that somehow he had actually seen his wife's spirit. The doctors claimed that these were hallucinations caused by a head injury he suffered during the fire. However, I believe that his wife's spirit was really there. Sometimes when someone dies with something haunting them, some people say it comes back to haunt their loved ones, or, in some cases, to haunt them as well. Then I kept thinking, what the hell had happened to Phil? It scared me to think that maybe Elsa, his wife, had not found peace and was now somehow still clinging to him. It was a tragic story, and despite everything I had seen during my shifts at the hospital, that was an experience that scarred me forever. At the end of the day, I went home with no answers, only a deep sense of sadness and questions that would never be answered. Phil's experience would be something that would haunt me forever. In that world where grief and death often seem to intertwine, sometimes ghosts are not just memories, but are those who cling to life, seeking to hold on to what they left behind. My father was in the final weeks of his treatment at a state hospital, so I decided to visit him on Father's Day. He had been in a mental health facility in the state of Georgia for several months after experiencing a serious bout of depression. That place has a long and somewhat creepy history, which makes it a bit intriguing, actually. During my visit, my father and I started chatting about weird experiences and a couple of disturbing stories that had happened to him while there that, frankly, made me never look at this facility the same way. The hospital opened its doors in 1902, and from then on became a haven for people with mental problems, and for those who committed crimes whose consequences they wanted to escape by feigning insanity. At first, it was designed to help those who needed it most, but before long it became a total chaos with overcrowding. The number of patients kept growing, so the hospital had to expand its facilities many times. But of course, that didn't mean there was enough staff to care for everyone. By 1935, things got even uglier, and the governor decided to fire the superintendent of the place, along with 80% of the employees, but the replacements they brought in were chosen more for their political connections than their ability to work with patients. After that purge, other problems arose, and that is that the new people they hired had no idea how to treat people. And instead of improving, things got worse. The treatment of patients worsened considerably. In 1949, the media brought to light the disaster that was taking place. They reported on the overcrowding and mistreatment suffered by the inmates, in addition to telling stories about many cases of severe malnutrition, as many did not receive enough food. It was not until 1953 that a real change began to take shape in the institution. The government and those in charge of the hospital finally saw that something had to be done to improve the situation, so new policies were established, trained personnel were asked to be hired, and, little by little, the welfare of the patients began to be guaranteed. As a result of this measure, conditions at the hospital began to improve, and inmates began to receive the attention they deserved, and the facility became more selective in admitting patients who underwent a thorough psychological evaluation prior to admission. By the 1940s, the patient population had dropped from more than 2,000 to around 600, and today there are about 250. Fortunately, despite all the rifts the center went through over the decades, in the last 20 years, the place has become a reference for its quality of service. But the reason I mention all this is because all this murky past gave rise to many stories related to apparitions and unexplained events that many patients and internal staff have witnessed over the years, and my father was one of those who had his own encounter with the unexplained during his stay in that place. My dad liked to keep busy, so he was always volunteering to do different tasks, whether it was helping with activities for patients or lending his support to staff in various programs. He was always on the go. He has never liked to be idle. I understand that the hospital was more akin to a rehabilitation center, and compared to other places, the inmates there had a little more freedom. They could go out whenever they felt like it and could also get involved in whatever activities they wanted. However, there was a part of the hospital that was kind of like a prison, and on one such occasion, he helped a lady who worked in that area with the laundry, and together they folded a bunch of sheets and towels. But when they left for a moment to look for some baskets to put them in, when they came back, they found everything thrown away and disarranged. The strange thing is that this area was always locked, so no one should have been able to get in and make such a mess. The worker there, whose name was Eucharis, told my dad that a ghost was haunting the place and that his name was Charles. She explained to him that they have different names for the ghosts that are said to inhabit that part of the prison, because there are so many that they have even had to close some rooms because the spirits that inhabit there are so violent that they have even caused physical harm to the workers who enter those places. That is why every time a resident or intern wants to move, the new ones refuse to stay because strange and frightening things happen. Even the former director's office. They say it is so haunted that he told the staff that if they didn't get him a new space for his things, he was going to leave, and that he had seriously warned them. My dad also mentioned that crazy things happened there, like objects moving on their own and even things flying through the air. The atmosphere scared everyone. Since he was able to get out of the hospital often and had a job outside, some guys and he decided to do some local work, maintaining the lawn around the hospital and the nearby cemetery. So on an afternoon they had arranged, my dad and a small group of guys were working on a part of the grounds that was no longer in use. They were near an old building that was part of the complex, but had been boarded up since the 1980s. The building was full of broken windows that showed everything inside, and while they were going about their work, chatting casually, suddenly he and another boy saw someone walking around inside. Dad and his partner told their boss that they thought someone else was there. They thought it was weird to see a guy in a place that had been empty for years, but the boss laughed and said it was probably just a ghost, and they were imagining things. Even though my dad is a sensible guy, he and the others saw the figure clearly enough to notice his clothes. "Did you see what he was wearing?" the other guy asked him, a little scared. "Yes," my dad replied. "Someone is playing with us. It's a person." And then he reappeared, walking quickly down the hallway toward them. From the window, they kept seeing the stranger approaching and decided to hide in a corner near the garage. The guy was wearing an old black and white suit with a matching hat and had his head down, as if he wanted to hide his face, The boy who was with my dad ran out saying he couldn't work there anymore because he was terrified, but my dad yelled at him to run forward to go catch whoever was trying to scare them. The boy hesitated for a moment, but did as Dad told him. And together, they ran to catch the man, but at one point he seemed to just vanish. They stopped right where the man in the hat was supposed to be, but he was gone. The building was empty. They checked all the doors, and surprisingly, no one was there. Somehow, their boss managed to get the keys to investigate that part of the old building, and my dad said there was so much dust inside that they could see footprints on the floor, but they found no sign of the guy they saw. That guy must be planning something weird, my old man thought, because he was doing nothing but hiding from us and covering his face. However, several months went by and nothing happened, until one day, he volunteered to do some maintenance work in the office of the center's director, and upon entering he saw a huge billboard where there were photographs of all the men who had run the center since its founding in the early 1990s. But of all the figures there was one that caught his attention. This was the man who ran the center between 1922 and 1935, a guy named Arthur Bennett, who looked exactly like the guy he had seen in the abandoned building and was dressed the same way as in the picture. At that moment, my father was shocked. It was him, he had no doubt. Later, he learned from the secretary that this man had died of a fatal heart attack in that abandoned building in 1935. At that time, that was the administrative building of the complex, and that was where the director's office was located. It was not until 2 decades later that the administrative offices were moved to the building where they are today. When I was little, I had a lot of psychological and behavioral problems. I have always been someone complicated, but when I turned 14, things got even more difficult. I started self-harming and hurting others and refusing to go to school, so I was put on a waiting list for a children's psychiatric hospital. I'm not sure if being on that list for almost half a year should have been a red flag, but at the time I just enjoyed being sick. For me, that meant sneaking out of school and spending hours playing The Sims until 6 in the morning for months at a time. However, when it came time to pack up to leave for the hospital, I have to admit that I didn't want to go at all. I wanted help, but the thought of being away from home for 6 weeks terrified me more than anything. That was how long it would take for them to evaluate me and see what was wrong. And then, they would decide whether to treat me or admit me for longer. I arrived at the hospital in a mess, with my mom helping me carry my suitcase. The nurses could tell I wasn't happy to be there. "Did you come of your own free will?" the doctor asked me. I just shook my head, shaking my head. They just ignored my answer and said they could get a court order to force me to stay. I was never taken before a judge, nor did I have a chance to defend myself or tell my side of the story. My parents never spoke to anyone from the court either. They saw my medical records and signed a document that had me trapped in that hellish place for 6 weeks. I remember my suitcase being searched and I felt like I had just entered a prison. The first scary thing that happened was that very night, since, as I mentioned, I had a history of self-injury. When wounds heal, they often itch, and I had just reopened some scabs. When I went to ask the nurse for a bandage, everyone was on alert. They thought I did it intentionally and I couldn't prove that I didn't do it. So what do you do with a 14-year-old patient in a situation like that? Do you maybe talk to him? Do you try to help? No, they decided to take away my necklace that my mom gave me and a bracelet that belonged to my ex-girlfriend, who I still had feelings for, and then they sent me to a respite room for 24 hours. That room was small, with a tiny window and barely room for a bed. If I needed to go to the bathroom, I had to ask a nurse to go with me. My entire wardrobe, down to my underwear and pajamas, was stored in the main office, so every time I needed some clothes, I had to make the trek to the office and ask for them. On top of that, I could only leave to go to the bathroom, and I was left all alone in that break room. No one came to check on me. It was a real nightmare. I didn't understand how that could help me heal mentally because it was so horrible to be in that place. I can assure you that every 8 out of 10 thoughts that came into my head were suicidal. Getting out of that room didn't make me much better. In the first 2 weeks, I suffered from horrible stomach pains. I got up several times at night to go to the bathroom. And even though I wasn't in the break room, I still couldn't access the common rooms. I had to walk down the hallway because my stomach wouldn't let me sleep. Often I did not get enough sleep and ended up sleeping most of the day, causing me to miss group activities. When I complained, I was told that if I spent the night wandering the halls, I would clearly be tired and should be kept in bed. Because of that, since I didn't participate in the group activities, I was left with no outdoor time. So yes, that was a privilege I had to earn, even if it was just sitting on the front steps with a nurse. That meant that for 6 weeks I was mostly cooped up all the time, except for the times I went to school and on weekends when I was let out at home. It was sadly evident that none of the nurses really cared about us. They didn't look like real nurses, they looked more like prison guards. One of them gave the impression of having lived on the street, while another breathed as if she had smoked a pack of cigarettes a day all her life. In fact, all of them, and I mean all of them, were heavy smokers. Whenever they got a break, they would go for a smoke right outside the door, exposing the other kids dealing with nicotine withdrawal to a feast of smoke. During my 6 weeks in the psychiatric ward, I saw a psychiatrist twice, once for a general evaluation and once for an IQ test. Those who have dealt with mental health issues probably know the unhelpful phrases they tell you, such as, "just get over it," or "get over it." Once, a patient who had arachnophobia came out of her room screaming because a spider had landed right on her face. I'm now told I have bipolar depression and panic disorder, and my current psychiatrist suggested I might be dealing with borderline personality disorder. So the lesson here is clear. Do your research well before entering a hospital. I hope I never see those guards, nurses, or doctors ever again. Maybe my story is not related to ghosts and supernatural things, but believe me, what I experienced in there was scarier than any encounter with something otherworldly. Sometimes the living can be more ruthless and terrifying than any supernatural being hiding in the shadows. This happened in 2011. At the time, I was working as a construction worker and our crew was deep into renovating an old hospital that had been closed for quite some time. This place had been built in the 1950s, and from what we were told, it closed its doors in the late 1990s because of funding problems and because the facilities were completely obsolete. Our job was to convert this dilapidated site into a modern, high-end medical office. At first, everything seemed normal, but when we arrived, the atmosphere got weird pretty quickly. The first time I entered the hospital, I got the impression that people had run out of there. There were discarded beds in the rooms, medical machinery lying around, and even patient records still in their dusty folders on the desks. It was like stepping into a time capsule, only badly deteriorated by neglect and the elements. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mold and decay was unmistakable. For the first few weeks, all was relatively quiet. The team was busy tearing down walls, removing old fixtures, and preparing the place for renovation. But then things started to get a little strange. One night, I was asked to stay late to supervise the unloading of some new equipment. It was after 7 p.m. and everyone else had gone home, so I was left alone in that giant, dreary building with only a flashlight and a portable radio for company. The electricity was out due to the construction work, so I was relying on a small generator that managed to keep the work lights on as I walked through the long, dark corridors of the old hospital. As I walked, I started to hear footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was just an echo of my own movements, but when I stopped, the footsteps continued for a few more seconds. Then I quickly turned and pointed my flashlight down the hallway, but there was nothing, just darkness and the faint hum of the electric generator. I tried to ignore it and go on with my work, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. After all, it is not uncommon to have noises out of place in these old places. A few minutes later, I went into one of the old patient rooms to check that the floors were safe, and suddenly I heard a soft voice. At first, I thought it was a figment of my imagination, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. It was a woman's voice. I froze, paralyzed in the same place. I wasn't sure if I should respond or if it would be better to run away from there, as the echo of that voice echoed in my mind, making me feel more and more uncomfortable. I approached slowly, peeking my head around the door frame, my heart pounding a mile a minute. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just the silence of the hospital. I decided that maybe I should have stayed in the reception room, but it was too late for regrets. I returned to my duties, but I could no longer get that voice out of my head. Something inside me told me that there was something else in that place, something I couldn't see, but it was definitely present. A few minutes passed and the tension increased. 3 times I heard that voice. The first time it sounded far away, as if it was coming from one of the next rooms. The second time it seemed to be right behind me, and the third time almost like a whisper in my ear. That last time, I felt a shiver run down my back, and I knew I had no choice. I had to look for the source of that voice. So with my flashlight in hand and my heart in my mouth, I started walking towards where I felt I was being called. Each step became heavier, as if the air was getting thicker around me. As I moved forward, memories of stories about the hospital began to flood my mind. I had heard rumors about patients who had passed away there, and that many claimed their souls were still grieving there. Could it be that this voice was an echo from the past? I remembered. I had once heard stories of people claiming to have heard noises in this building and even seen people wandering around here, but I never really took them seriously. After all, abandoned places like this are a magnet for drug addicts and homeless people, so it might as well have been flesh and blood people and not ghosts. When I finally reached the door where the whisper seemed to come from, I took a deep breath and was about to open it when suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out. The darkness enveloped me, and at that moment the voice became clearer. "Help me." That simple request froze my blood. Without thinking, I flung open the door, thinking that maybe a woman was in trouble there for some reason. But upon opening the door, I found myself in an empty room with only an antique chair in the center. There was no one there. It was then that I knew something much darker and more disturbing was hiding behind the walls of that old hospital. I needed answers, and now it was no longer just a job. This was something bigger, something that would force me to confront the unknown. As I tried to process what had happened, that voice whispered my name. At that moment, my heart felt like a runaway horse in my chest. I looked around the room, shining my flashlight into every nook and cranny, as if that would help me find someone or something, but of course there was no one there. The voice came again, this time much more intense and clear, as if it was right next to me. "Help me," it said to me. It was enough for my survival instinct to take over. I ran out of the room like I was escaping a fire, not caring what I was leaving behind. I ran down the hallways, dodging the rooms we had yet to remodel, and back to the main entrance. As I did so, I felt those footsteps following me, almost at my heels, but I never once looked back. When I finally reached the lobby, I was panting and drenched in sweat, even though it was the middle of winter. I locked myself in the doorway, fearful, waiting for the delivery truck to arrive with the equipment. I didn't tell the driver what had happened, as I didn't want him to think I was crazy or had some kind of mental problem. The next day, I decided to share my weird encounter with one of the fellows, a guy named Emmis. When I told him what I had experienced, he just looked at me with a raised eyebrow and finally said, "You're not the first one to hear weird things here. There have been more than one who has had similar experiences." I froze. Apparently, several of our colleagues had heard voices and seen mysterious shadows gliding around the building. Most disturbing was what he mentioned about the old morgue. Some even claimed to have seen figures in hospital gowns walking the corridors late at night. That definitely sent chills down my spine, but the final straw for me came a few days later. I was working late again, but this time I wasn't alone. There was another guy from the team named Felix who was with me, both of us trying to finish a job in one of the patient rooms. As we were packing up the tools and equipment, we suddenly heard an incredible rumbling sound coming from the hallway. It was a muffled sound, as if something heavy had fallen to the floor. Felix and I looked at each other, intrigued and a little nervous, and grabbed our flashlights. We thought maybe some part of the equipment had fallen, so we headed towards the source of the sound, and when we got there, we were dumbfounded. An entire metal shelf had been knocked over. The strange thing was that this rack, which we had secured tightly to the wall a few days earlier, would not fall easily without good force. It was impossible. We looked around, but there was no sign of anyone else being there, and all the doors were locked from the inside. I couldn't stop the encounter I had a few days ago from coming rushing back to my mind, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to make Felix nervous. On the contrary, I tried to ease the tension by saying that maybe we hadn't secured the rack properly, and he nodded, but I knew he was still nervous. Felix and I cleaned up the mess quickly and got out of there as fast as we could. That night, I flatly refused to work alone in that sad hospital. I told my boss that if he needed someone to supervise, he should find me a partner. Fortunately, he was able to get someone to join me for the remaining shifts. The job was finished a few weeks later, and almost every night something would happen. Noises, things falling, footsteps, and I swear I could even see a shadow wandering around one of the last nights I was left supervising the work. However, once the work was completed, I admit that I have never set foot in that place since. nor do I plan to ever do so. Today the hospital is up and running and is one of the most modern and best equipped in the entire city. But still, I just pray to God that I never put myself in the situation of having to be treated there, because I really don't know what I would do. I never thought I would find myself in a situation like this, but here I am recounting this hair-raising experience. Let's start from the beginning. It was a random Friday and I was in the neighborhood coffee shop with a couple of friends, enjoying a hot chocolate and a delicious croissant. Mid-conversation, all of a sudden, I felt a sharp pain in my lower abdomen. At first, I thought it was just a passing indigestion, but that passing turned into a much more intense monster. Not even 5 minutes passed and I was already bent over the table, trying not to make a spectacle of myself. But the pain was raging at me, as if it wanted to knock me out. My friends looked at me worried, and one of them, Carlos, asked me if I was okay. I couldn't even speak. I could only shake my head as the pain took hold of me. Desperate, I decided it was time for someone to help me, so I got up from the table, staggering as if I were in a horror movie. I barely managed to walk to the exit before collapsing on the floor. I remember the last image I saw before I lost consciousness was Carlos's frightened face, screaming and crying for help. When I awoke, I was in the hospital infirmary, with bright lights above me and a strange smell of disinfectant filling my lungs. I felt groggy, as if I'd been tossing and turning in a laundry room. A nurse stood beside me, explaining that I had had an attack of appendicitis and would need an operation immediately. At that moment, a shiver ran down my spine. The thought of being in an operating room scared me. I had seen too many horror movies not to feel uneasy. So, after a couple of hours in which I was given a couple of medications, the pain subsided a bit. I felt a little more alert as I was wheeled into the operating room. And although I tried to calm myself by taking deep breaths, I couldn't stop thinking about all those stories of people who never woke up again. The nurse who accompanied me noticed my anxiety and told me not to worry, that everything was going to be fine. But of course, that never completely reassured me. I remember they put the anesthesia mask on me, and instead of relaxing, I started thinking about the things I was leaving behind. It's just an appendicitis operation, I tried to remind myself. Nothing to be alarmed about. But just as I was about to let go of the anesthesia, something strange happened. A cold sensation ran through my body, as if a presence was beyond me. I felt heavier, as if the air became thick and difficult to pass through. The next time I opened my eyes, I was not in the operating room. My senses were alert, but that place was unfamiliar. It was dark and eerie, and there was an overwhelming silence that enveloped everything around me. Instead of lying in a hospital bed, I was in a narrow corridor with gray, deathly walls, and there was a kind of mist floating around that prevented me from seeing more than a few steps. I was frowning, wondering what kind of nightmare I had gotten myself into. I began to walk slowly, my hands leaning on the walls to steady myself, and suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, like a faint murmur that seemed to call my name. Javi? The voice sounded familiar, but when I turned around, there was no one there, just the enveloping mist and that eerie silence that filled everything. I felt a shiver run through me, and anxiety took hold of me again. I decided to keep going, thinking that maybe I would find a way out or someone who could help me. But the further I walked, the more trapped I felt. The walls began to close in, and the air became even denser and more oppressive. Every time I turned the corner, I felt a dark presence behind me, as if something was lurking, perhaps beasts or crazed spirits. At that moment, I thought about anesthesia and the possibility that my mind was playing tricks on me. But I was confused and overwhelmed. Nothing was clear to me at that moment. Finally, I came to a half-open door at the end of the hallway. It was different. It looked like old wood and was decorated with some engravings that I didn't understand and had never seen before. Without thinking, I pushed the door open, and what I saw on the other side made my heart skip a beat. It was an operating room. On the table, there was a body covered with a blue sheet. I couldn't quite make it out, but the feeling that it was myself was driving me crazy. As I got closer, I heard the murmur of laughter again. Distant noises. It was the familiar voices of my friends, as if they were calling me from the background. I could feel that I was caught between two worlds, and all I wanted was to get out of there. But just as I was about to enter, the door slammed shut behind me. I turned and saw a group of white figures approaching, wearing doctor's coats. They couldn't be the doctors I knew. Something was definitely wrong. At that moment, I screamed very loudly, and that scream echoed down the hallway like an endless echo, and suddenly everything began to fade. The laughter began to die down, and the fog began to dissipate as the echo of that scream continued to bounce off into space. The fading of that oppressive place was a real relief, and as the mist was gone, peace returned to me. Suddenly, I began to hear beeping in the distance. It was loud and constant, a beep that repeated in a rhythmic fashion. When I came to, I was in a hospital room, but this time everything was different. There was no fog or overwhelming silence, and a nurse was in front of me, looking at me with concern. I was safe, but the experience left me with a lump in my throat. After all, the operation went well, and although I survived, the vision of that other world remains etched in my mind to this day. I always wonder if some part of me is still trapped in those shadows, while the rest of me moves on. Sometimes, in dreams, I return to that dark hallway and the anxiety never quite fades. That experience became a strange part of my story, and it was so vivid that I remember it like any other earthly event in my life. It was an ordinary day on the night shift at the hospital. The chill of the night was creeping in through the windows, but the warmth emanating from the bustle of the intensive care unit kept the air somewhat more bearable. As an ICU nurse, I was used to the routine. The monitors beeping, the lights flickering, and the smell of alcohol and disinfectant filling the air was something I was very used to and was already part of my day-to-day life. My name is Elvira, and I really didn't expect to ever have to tell a story like this, but life is very unpredictable. Although everything that night seemed as normal as usual, there was something different in the air. I didn't notice it at first, but then it became very noticeable. I began my day as usual, checking on the status of the patients. Everything seemed in order, and the hours passed quickly, interrupted only by the sound of the occasional distant scream or the echo of hurried footsteps in the corridors. But who could have imagined that I would be confronted with the unexplainable for the first time that night? It was around midnight when I first entered the room of Emma, an 8-year-old girl who had been battling a complicated bacterial illness for months. Her room had been decorated by her mother with brightly colored pictures, something that brought a bit of joy amid the terror of critical medicine. But that night, the room was colder and quieter than usual, and my heart shrank a little more as I noticed that the machine monitoring his breathing sounded somewhat unusual. No, we can't let this happen," I mumbled through my teeth as I adjusted the settings on the monitor. I was grateful to have some colleagues nearby. I saw them out of the corner of my eye. They were veterans, so they already figured out what was going on. I tried to concentrate on my work, but a strange sensation ran through my body, as if someone nearby was watching me. I exchanged quick glances with my colleagues, but nothing seemed out of place. After a while, I decided to step outside to get some air. I walked through the deserted corridors of the hospital until a colleague who was new to the area and to the career itself called me to help her take an IV from a patient she was having trouble with. I helped her without hesitation, and when I was done, I went back down the hallway to return to Emma's room, when suddenly, I saw a shadow in the corner out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing there. "Elvira, you're seeing things. Is the lack of sleep getting to you?" I said to myself, but the feeling that someone was there wouldn't go away. As I continued walking down the hallway, the light began to flicker, and suddenly I felt a movement, a brush. It may have been the air, but the slight contact made me shiver. I turned quickly, and there she was, standing in the corner, a little girl in a white gown and a little disheveled. Her eyes were large and dark and looked at me with a gentleness that instantly unsettled me. "Where's Emma?" the little girl asked in a voice so soft it sounded like a whisper. "I don't know what you're talking about, little girl." "Emma is in her room, right over there in the front," I replied, feeling stupid as if I had to explain to her where her own friend was. I looked around the hallway for my colleagues, but they were busy, so I looked back toward the girl, who had now taken a step closer, her face now half illuminated by the dim light of the fading hallway. "Emma's gone," she said again in that soft voice, sketching a small smile that, though cute, had something disturbing about it. Her statement caused some internal alarms to start ringing in me, but I remained silent, and then she continued, "It feels good now." The air got a little stagnant in the place after her words. I tried to remain calm and said, "Listen, do you want me to help you find Emma?" using that tone one employs when trying to handle a situation with a child. But the girl just laughed. At that moment, I began to hear Emma's monitor begin to beep sharply. The door to her room was right out front, so I could hear it clearly and ran over there. As I arrived, a flash of red enveloped the room, and at that moment my heart dropped to the floor. "No!" I screamed, immediately turning towards Emma's bed, and an infinite sadness came over me. I ran to her, trying to revive her, but it was too late. Emma was gone. Her frail body was motionless and had no vital signs. Chaos broke out all around me as I called for the doctors, and at one point I turned my eyes to the door, and there was the little girl smiling. I looked at her for a couple of seconds, and when I tried to ask her how she knew, she simply vanished before my eyes. I stood completely still, frozen, in shock. The doctors and a couple of other nurses came into the room trying to revive Emma, but I was completely paralyzed, my eyes fixed on the door, not believing what had just happened. Everything I had witnessed stunned me, and suddenly, sadness and horror washed over me. My head was full of questions, and my mind struggled to process what I had experienced. Emma was pronounced dead at 1:51 a.m. After that, the night progressed into an eerie silence, and although the work continued, I could not get the image of that little girl who announced her death to me out of my mind. I never knew who that little girl was or why she chose me that night, but this experience stayed with me forever, and I can't help but think about it often. Who was she? And what was her relationship to Emma? Questions that may never have an answer but will always be swirling around in my mind.